It's wonderful to be here with you this morning for this Salvete service. And it's just wonderful to be back in church in person, and especially in this place at Leichhardt. This is a special community, and I'm honoured to have the chance to preach here. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in Aotearoa, when you're driving through, a lot of cities and towns have a sign that welcomes visitors, usually with a slogan of some kind. So, absolutely, positively, Wellington. Or Auckland, the world's most livable city. And for smaller towns, these signs can be attempts to attract tourists or new residents. So for Whanganui, which is a town that's a little off the beaten track, the sign says, Whanganui, well worth the journey. For Wairoa, a town which is even more remote and depressed, the sign says, Wairoa, the way New Zealand used to be. And then for Featherston, a town that's just on the way into Wellington, so about 45 minutes out, the sign reads, if you lived here, you'd be home by now. So another city slogan that's a favourite of mine comes from when I lived in the US in the late 2000s. Keep Portland weird. Keep Portland weird. And this slogan was intended to celebrate what was unique and unusual about this West Coast city and its residents. But I want to suggest that this is also a useful slogan for us this morning. As we enter a new season of study and life, it's a slogan that we could adopt and adapt. Keep Jesus weird. So why this slogan? So today as Christians, we're remembering the Transfiguration. So this was the story that came through in our gospel reading from Luke. It's a time in the Christian calendar when we remember one of the stranger scenes in the Gospels. So there's a lot of weird and outrageous stuff in the Bible, but our Transfiguration story is particularly unusual. So as Luke tells us, 3 of the disciples go up on a mountain with Jesus to pray. We hear that Jesus' face appears to change, his clothes become radiant or luminescent, and he's heard in deep conversation with 2 men who died a long time ago, Moses and Elijah, the lawgiver and the prophet. So at least to me, this sounds like a scene from something like The Twilight Zone or a very hastily scripted sci-fi movie where they're trying to use up the special effects budget, so they're just throwing in everything they can think of. So this is weird stuff. In our Christian calendar, we remember the story of the Transfiguration on the last Sunday of the season of Epiphany. So as we know, Epiphany is a season of joy and celebration. It's the season that follows Christmas, in which we celebrate God's gift and grace in Jesus Christ. And for many of us, it's also, at least in a normal year, this is also the time when we take holidays, so Epiphany is often a happy time. This week on Wednesday, we move into a new season, Lent. And this is the season where we begin to prepare ourselves for Easter, and we're looking towards Christ's suffering and death on the cross. So Transfiguration Sunday today is a kind of liminal moment. It sits at the limit, or it's an in-between time and space between Epiphany on the one side and Lent on the other. So we're caught between joy and darkness. And this is also what comes through in our gospel reading. So the 3 disciples on the mountain see Jesus' glory. They catch a glimpse of who he is in all his power. But then, as Luke tells us, a cloud descends and covers them, and they were terrified. So the weirdness of the Transfiguration, with its mix of glory and terror, has inspired countless Christian artists. And I think we've got an image on the screen here. So this is a painting by the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael. It's the very last painting he did, and it's depicting the scene of the Transfiguration. So we can see Raphael's depicting Jesus as luminescent, glowing, framed on one side by Elijah, on the other side by Moses, And he's even chosen to have Jesus floating off the ground. So it's not there in the text, and he's taking some license. And this is, by having sort of Jesus floating, it's invoking the resurrection and even more so the ascension. So it's looking forward to these other moments in the gospel. To further draw out Christ's glory, Raphael presents the three apostles at the bottom very differently. They're hunched over, shielding their eyes and carrying in fear. And right at the bottom, you can also sort of see, I took some license and I've chopped a masterpiece in half, so I've sort of cropped just half the image. He also shows our next scene that we heard in our reading, so the exorcism that Jesus performs, and that just makes this contrast between Jesus and what's going on below even more sharp. So what do we make of this strange event? So for those of us who are Protestants, the Transfiguration doesn't tend to feature prominently in our calendars and in our theologies. And perhaps I'll just do a poll. So hands up if you're planning to go to a Transfiguration party tonight. Okay, if anyone's holding one, I'd love to come. So the question is, why aren't we all having Transfiguration parties? And I suspect part of it is that we just don't know quite what to do with this story. So we celebrate Easter, we celebrate Christmas, but this one's just a bit too weird, so we try and forget about it and put it to the side. This story doesn't fit with our attempts to make faith more relevant or credible, and it provides little guidance for who we are or how we're to act in the world. You know, what do we do with the Jesus who glows and hovers? And we're in good company. So in the gospel reading, Peter, James, and John also don't seem to know what to do. So Peter says to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." So Peter clearly recognizes that something significant is going on. It's good for us to be here. But he's unsure what this means, and he proposes a delaying tactic. He attempts to prolong and preserve this moment so that he can start to work it out. Let us make 3 dwellings. Let us settle in. Let's take some time. Let's make sense of this. And so here I just want to suggest a couple of reasons why we too may want to just sit with this event of the Transfiguration. Or like Peter, we should attend to this event and just try and unravel a little of what it might mean for us. So just a couple of things. So first, the Transfiguration testifies to the power and glory of Christ. Along with the resurrection, it's one of the few moments in the Gospels where Christ's divine glory is directly manifest. We even get a voice from heaven. "This is my Son, my chosen, listen to him." And most of us are used to affirming the glory of Christ, but we should just pause here to remember how crazy this claim is. So as Christians, we hold that a poor Jewish peasant who will soon be executed for treason is the one who God has chosen, the one who holds power and authority over all things. So this is what we believe. And we're so used to sort of saying this, it can start to just become too familiar, and it can, we just forget how crazy we are as Christians. And part of the problem here is that we're tempted to think that we just know who Jesus is, that we understand his teachings, and that we basically know what being Christian is about. And we forget the strangeness of the one who we follow, of what we're reading and hearing and what we believe. And so it's good just to always take a moment to pause and remember that. Second, it's significant where Luke places the Transfiguration in his gospel. And if we just concentrate on this moment in itself, we can lose sight of this. So in the passage before today's reading, Jesus has just predicted his suffering and his death. And this is where he promises to his followers, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must take up their cross and follow me." And then in Luke's gospel, after the Transfiguration, as we heard in today's reading, we have the story of a public exorcism. So the disciples have attempted and failed to drive out a demon, and Jesus alone is able to do it. So we've got this moment of glory and revelation juxtaposed between suffering, or the prediction of suffering and death on the one hand, and the failure of the disciples on the other. So in other words, when Christ's glory is revealed on the mountaintop, it's framed by predictions of suffering and realities of struggle and failure. And even during the Transfiguration itself, it's significant that the disciples are barely able to stay awake. So this glorious thing is happening, and they're struggling to be present. And I think this is the case for most of us, or certainly for me at least. So in our lives, in our study and work, we're more often struggling and stuck in the mess of things. We too are just trying to stay awake, trying to understand what's going on around us, and just trying to find a way forward. So now and then we catch glimpses of God's glory in our own lives and those of others. We have moments of success, moments of celebration, moments of clarity, moments of conversion, when everything seems to make sense. And we perhaps even have those rare moments where we hear the voice of God speaking from the clouds. But like Peter and the disciples, we don't get to live on the mountain. We don't get to stay there. We don't get to set up shelters. Instead, we descend back into the daily struggle and toil. And the same cloud that descends on Peter and James and John also descends on us. Most of us live most of the time in a state of confusion and anxiety. So finally, I just want to finish by reflecting on what the Transfiguration might mean for those of us who are entering a new year of study. So those of us who are new or returning students can sometimes be tempted to think that learning as well as faith is about finding answers. So in this view, learning is about accumulating knowledge, gaining mastery over certain areas and disciplines, working hard and achieving something, completing a degree, and then moving on. And I think all of this is right, but I want to suggest that learning is more basically about encountering and grappling with things that we don't understand. Not about getting answers, but rather about asking questions. It's about deepening our wrestling, following our curiosity, and opening ourselves to new ways of thinking and being in the world. And this is why I think events like the Transfiguration are so valuable. So in all their weirdness, events like the Transfiguration interrupt us, they resist our attempts at understanding and explanation, and they press us to see Jesus and ourselves in new ways. So the Transfiguration is about wonder and mystery for the disciples and for us. It's a weird event. It propels us on, it presses us to go deeper. And this can be terrifying, and it can also be glorious. So where have we arrived? So we return to our slogan that we began with, keep Jesus weird. Our slogan for this morning not only reminds us that as Christians we believe some outrageous and strange things, it also encourages us to press into them. It encourages us to claim these things as central to our faith and to who we are together. As Christians and as students, the revelation of God's glory in Christ sets us on a new path of discipleship, learning, and faith. Thanks be to God. Amen.